know correlation isn't causation, but is there any like hypothesis for why that happens?
This does work.
Yes.
First of all, you're exactly right. So if you take a large droplet that still has some of the aromatic, those low molecular weight components that are soluble and volatile, and the solubility in the water column, yes, as you make them smaller, the amount that goes out will be faster. Ultimately, the total amount is the same, so it's a pulsed exposure. So yeah, in a single dispersion experiment, that would be the case. During Macondo, over days and days and days, it's kind of a different situation. But yes, small droplets, certainly they are more amenable to biodegradation and loss of that soluble component. The air volatilization, by the time they rose up through the water column, again through 1,500 meters, most of the aromatic small, let's say the benzene type rings, those had already been stripped out. So whether or not it was volatile with or without dispersant U sub C, that component pretty much was in the water column. But whatever rose up through the surface without dispersants and formed a slick, it still had a volatile component with it that made its way into the air. With the dispersant use, that rise rate was essentially made so long, or such a slow rate, that they just never got up there, and then they didn't express themselves on the surface. So water column exposure, certainly it's enhanced for solubility, but it's a different phenomenon for what gets up to the surface. Well, that was two parts.
Okay, my second part is, so since biodegradation obviously requires that like the picoplankton, the bacterial component, is that testing for the bacteria concentration common when looking at using dispersants? And continuing on that, would it be better if you picked like a highly productive area, an area that has a lot of these plankton, but also may have a lot of shrimp or other, might be a productive fishery area, or would it be better to pick an area that was less productive, planktonic, or less productive, but would take longer to degrade that oil?
Well, I think part of it is a three-part answer. One part is that oil-degrading bacteria exist everywhere in any environment. In fact, even in Antarctica, if you go to the South Pole and take samples of snow with the persistent organic pollutants that are there, they find bacteria that are degrading those. So they're available everywhere. The population of the bacteria is actually going to respond in comparison to what the food availability is. So different bacteria in that degrading community will actually respond, because once they're feeding, they're turning it into energy for the animal itself and biomass for reproduction. It'll split and actually grow. And the dynamics will change, where depending on what's available for food supply, the distribution of different bacteria may change in response to that. So that works in that favor. I think the third part of the answer is that factor, as far as concerned whether there is enough bacteria in the environment, is not the driver. Sometimes in certain environments, especially in the Pacific, in certain locations, maybe the argument might be, are nutrients available, which might be the more limiting factor. But Ed, I don't know if you wanted to add to that?
Several years ago, we were looking at having to add bacteria, and that has turned into a useless effort. The bacteria are everywhere, and they're capable of degrading oil. The next issue is all the nutrients there, and in coastal areas, estuarine areas, the answer is yes. But there are, I'm sure, some areas of the world where that might not be the case. I know in the Valdez incident, not the Exxon Valdez incident, the Valdez incident, a great emphasis was placed on nutrient modification rather than adding the bacteria. So you got plenty of bacteria. It's got to let Mother Nature do their thing, and the way to help Mother Nature do her thing is to take a big glob and break it into a lot of tiny little globs so that you can get more bacteria colonizing those in removing that oil from the ecosystem. Right? But that process does cause exposure to animals in that general area. So as Admiral Allen said, you know, we're dealing with bad options, which is the least bad option. And most of us think that dispersing, whether you do it on the surface or subsea, both of those have advantage over doing nothing.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a caveat to that. If you take oil and break it up into droplets with a dispersant, you're increasing the surface area, but it's a new surface. It's a surface that has dispersant molecules on it. And some of the dispersant molecules may not come off that easily, even though there's a partition coefficient between the dispersant at the interface and in the bulk water. Some dispersant species may stay at that interface. So the bacteria will eat the oil, but there's arguments about the distribution of bacteria at that interface, whether there's now since some of the dispersant components are sugar-based dispersants, that you could have bacteria that eat the sugars that are there, in addition to the bacteria that eat the oil.
We did
started something.
Yeah, we did some quick and dirty experiments during the spill where we degraded oil under optimum conditions using natural seawater and artificial seawater with dispersants and without dispersants, 10 to 20, 1 to 20 ratio. And the bottom line is that the dispersant and then with the natural seawater, with oil and with oil and dispersants, both degraded oil very quickly with half-lives on the order of 3 to 4 days. Amazingly how quickly that went away. So in this one experiment, the addition of dispersants didn't seem to slow degradation down.
Yeah, and just to kind of follow up with, some of the work, excellent. BJ's slides always impress me, the tools you have. But if you didn't even add dispersants, but just had fresh, seawater and oil, and you left it in the laboratory, like in some of BJ's experiments, you start to see that bacteria colonies form and that mycelium death. That actually, and a lot of the other byproducts produced by bacteria, actually serve as dispersants. It'll start to look like it's dispersed oil, even though no chemicals were added. The bacteria manufactured their own chemicals that had the same function. And it's all to make the oil more available to them, so it's actually for their own benefit. So.
Any other questions? Yes, Gary, please, Zach, please speak loudly.
I'll come up and make it repeated as necessary. A couple things. First is, DJ, you made mention of how there's some additional level of attention being paid to DOS as a component of dispersants. If I'm not mistaken, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, one of the reasons it seems to receive some attention is because after a dispersant application in a body of water, isn't it one of the components of dispersants that's the easiest to identify? Right, so I think one of the reasons they talk about DOS so much with regards to previous dispersant use or dispersant use in an area is because when you're looking for evidence of dispersant use after its application, DOS is one of the easiest components to find. So that often, in my mind, at least, speaking as myself, that may tend to give it more attention than some of the other components that are in dispersants.
Yeah, I completely agree. I also think that the other thing, and between, are saccharide, the sugar-based.
Right.
Can you repeat the question for folks?
Oh, I think the question was, DOS seems to be the one that's identified as being persistent, if I'm using the right word.
Or gets the attention.
Gets the attention. And Tom knows much more about this, so I should let Tom talk about it. But
Yeah.
but I think the other components of Corexit get degraded much faster. So.
And then my other thing was I think it's worth getting this particular issue on the record, and that is that in the NASA contingency plan, there's some deference apparently given to mechanical recovery as a response technology. Because even though those of us who deal with this on a daily basis and have to think about these things every day, we think about all the tools in our toolbox, giving particularly mechanical recovery, dispersant, in situ burning, the same level of consideration under the appropriate circumstances. But in the NCP, dispersants and in-situ burning are called alternative response technologies. So I think it's worth getting on the record, and you guys could speak to it, and maybe Mike could also speak to it, with dispersant and in-situ burn use considerations and how they fit into the national response system, the regional contingency planning, and the NRT's guidance on atypical dispersant use with regards to extended surface application as well as any application of subsea dispersants. So I think it's worth putting some of the stuff we talked about today in the context of how those applications or how those technologies are considered for use during a response, just to kind of get it on the record and give people some background. You know, these things aren't just thrown about as, you know, something we're going to go out and do without prior consideration and then consideration actually during the response.
Okay, so the comment from Gary was from a BSEE perspective that there's a perception that in-situ burn and dispersants are considered to be alternative technologies within the framework of the National Contingency Plan within the United States. And that's pretty true. There are places around the world, in fact, there's a perception that dispersants in many places are not allowed. I won't say banned because that's a different word, but not allowed. And in reality, there are over, 100 plus countries in which dispersants are considered to be either a primary or a secondary tool. And the secondary is more or less, I think, the way the United States government might characterize it. In industry, we use the phrase alternative technologies. Now we've changed that to applied technologies. So instead of ART being alternative, we recognize that in-situ burn dispersants should, in many cases, be a primary tool. And that's what we're trying to change. But that's actually a very good comment. And I wanted to actually hand this over to Paul, because he's got a very international perspective as well. But it is a tool in the toolbox, and that's our whole goal, is to make sure that they are considered that way.
Yeah, as Tom mentioned, I do work internationally a lot, and every country has their own way of looking at it, and some is it's a last resort when nothing else works. But I would say, if you paid attention to my slide on drivers, it's the drivers that are going to push you towards one response strategy or another. It simply becomes a matter of what can actually be effective and work at the scale you need it to work. So, sometimes it's going to be individual for each individual situation, but sometimes it's going to be the kind of oil spill, the weather, the climate type of situation, availability of resources. It just varies. What type of resources are at risk and what you can do. So it's one thing to say here are 5 different elements of your toolbox, but the one you're going to ultimately use are the one that works the best. And that's often driven by the scenario, not by your desire to use one or the other. And if it's a large offshore spill, you're somewhat driven towards the use of dispersants. A small offshore spill, maybe not, but a large one, and particularly a blowout scenario where you continually have new oil every day, you're just driven in that direction. The technologies don't really exist to be effective with any other response option, I think. So I would take a look at the drivers. That's my presentation was intended to show this is the situation, this was the science at the time, and this is why we went down that path, because it was the path that you had to go down to be effective.
Can I just add to that comment? I know in our position as extension specialists, we went out and spoke with a lot of folks on what their biggest concerns are from the oil spill. And of course, dispersants always rose to the top. That was the main topic. But could you possibly clarify, maybe we didn't talk too much about dispersants, where they can and cannot be used as far as close to the shoreline, because I know that I came across a few misconceptions in Florida that people said they saw planes with flying with dispersants being sprayed over the oyster beds and everywhere. So if you guys could possibly clarify that, that'd be great.
Well, I helped write the guidelines to the Caribbean cooperation, oil spill cooperation plan. And what I did, this was many years ago, and I pretty much copied the U.S. Approach to that, because politically it works well that way. But it was basically, the restrictions were something on the effect of 3 miles from the shoreline, 3 miles from coral reefs, and in water that was 10 meters deep. However, and it holds for the US as well, there's an extra sentence in there, and it's one of the slides that I omitted from my presentation. It says this whole scheme is overridden by net environmental benefit analysis. So I like to point to the Australian plan, which says don't disperse over coral unless net environmental benefit analysis indicates you need to protect another resource. And the same goes through with the don't spray less than 1 mile from the shoreline, don't spray in less than 10 meters depth, and all of those can be overridden. One of the things with this tropic study that I showed a couple slides of, we actually looked at a paper called Net Environmental Benefit Analysis for nearshore use of dispersants. So you wouldn't normally look to disperse over coral, but if you take a look at the whole ecosystem and the community, if the mangroves go, the coral are eventually going to go anyway. So you need to look a little bit differently at that. So there are guidelines, and
They're fighting for you.
Yeah, to follow up on the guidelines piece, it's 2 points. One of the arguments was during the Deepwater Horizon was dispersants used, and the answer is no. There was some observations people made and whether they were cleaning when watered for tests, but we know that we didn't do any applications in the nearshore environment. Second is we have done applications in the nearshore environment. And in Region 6, off of Louisiana in 2004, after Hurricane Ivan, there was several major impacts to pipelines that were ripped and torn. And there was one incident that was off the Mississippi Delta, off of basically off of Delta Wildlife Refuge, that the decision was made because within the RRT rules, there is a second set, as Paul said, that you can go down through the discussion on, is there environmental benefit? And the determination was made because of initially the number of impacts to the number of waterfowl on those small remnants of beaches on the Birdsplit Delta was millions. And the spill was right offshore, right about 2.5 miles offshore. It was a continuous release. And so under certain conditions, when the winds were onshore winds, dispersants were used near shore, but not when they were offshore winds. So they were done in a managed way over about a 9 to 10 day period. But that constituted where that argument and discussion happened, and dispersants were used in that shallower water with very positive benefits in a very managed way.
And just one thing further in support of that, again, the French research organization CEDRA did a study several years back that was called Discobiol. They come up with interesting names, but it was really about the coastal biology and the effect of dispersants on that. And they really looked at nearshore potential use of dispersants. And again, they came back with a NEVA argument that said there would be times where they would recommend the use of dispersants even close to shore because of what you were protecting.
And I guess, can I follow up? Again?
Sure.
And part of my question, though, was to speak specifically to the regime that currently exists under which we consider the use of dispersants in in-situ burning, vis-a-vis regional contingency plans, regional policies, and the national response team policy with regards to atypical dispersant use. So at least on the record, people understand that consideration of these technologies, how that's done, under what mechanisms, under what regime or considerations of dispersants and in-situ burning conducted.
That's a good question.
And I don't know whether you guys want to address it or whether Mike wants to address it.
I'll address parts of it, only because I work with Mike on the RT. But these are the how we work within the guidance that was established all the way back to the National Contingency Plan with the NRT and how that guidelines comes down. And by the mere fact that we've used dispersant under 9 spills in the Gulf of Mexico since Open 90, so that's 9 times in 26, 27 years, means that we don't use dispersants on every spill as a primary response. That discussion happens probably almost every spill of any significant size on whether or not dispersants should be used or not used in context with what by default is other conventional response technologies. And those are just really names. Alternative, conventional became names. I think when the Kaplan report or the FOSC is looking at response, he's really looking at all the tools that are available to him to manage an effective response with the appropriate technologies in context to the scale. I think Paul points it out real quick. When you reach a certain scale, some of these other tools may be overwhelmed readily. And so that brings you to where these other tools become the more appropriate choice. And so that's how it's factored. So I don't think you get caught up too much. We don't say we have to think about conventional first and then alternatives. Those are names that evolved over time. They look at it as the complete toolbox, but your justification for using some of these chemical dispersants or even burning even under certain situations, but is that what is my argument, and it often is because my conventional response capacity cannot respond to that spill appropriately. And that's when the decision is made. I don't know, Mike, if I hit it well enough for you or not.
Well, can I be more specific then?
No, yeah, why don't you just answer the question?
The regional response team has policies on.
No, I know where you're going. I know where you're going. I'm just waiting my turn. All right, Gary, you're lucky we still have time. Okay. So again, I'm Mike Sands with the Coast Guard District, and I serve as the Coast Guard's co-chair to Regional Response Team 6. And we do have existing policy. We do have existing policy in Region 6 that says beyond 3 nautical miles from land and at least 10 meters of water that aerial dispersants are pre-authorized. What does that mean? That means that the assigned Coast Guard captain of the port, which then is the predesignated federal on-scene coordinator, he or she could choose to deploy and apply aerial dispersants to mitigate an oil discharge. Doesn't say he or she shall, you must, but it says that you are pre-authorized. And how did we get there? Started way back in the mid-90s when a lot of things happened after Open 90 was passed, and a lot of stakeholder discussions, of course, Charlie and others within the Department of Commerce, with NOAA as a natural resource trustee for waterborne species, if you will, the Department of the Interior for U.S. Fish and Wildlife for more land-based and some birds. Those and many, many others were involved in lots of discussions, deliberations, looking at best available science at the time, so on and so forth. So this wasn't a knee-jerk reaction. This is not something that any entity that's part of the process takes lightly, but it does still exist. What we have done and what we have agreed upon post-Macondo is that although pre-authorization still remains out there, and it is valid, no one has taken that away, we agree that this is the 21st century and we're going to have a quick call, just in time conversation to talk about going from the notional that you could apply aerial dispersants anywhere beyond 3 miles and at least 10 meters of water in the Gulf of Mexico within your jurisdiction. We're going to have that specific conversation. We now know what date, what time, an estimate of the product, what is the product, and what species might be involved or in the area now. So we can have a better, more informed trade-off discussion without minimizing a quick and efficient response. Remember, if you go back, the whole nation is broken down into 2 federal agencies have the lead responsibility and an ultimate call to say yes or no. And that's the U.S. Coast Guard for the coastal areas and the Environmental Protection Agency for the inland zone. Now, one little nuance that's very key is, well then, if the Coast Guard has the call, then why is EPA shutting down the aerial dispersants used during Macondo? Well, that's a great question. And that how the National Contingency Plan is written is EPA basically has that veto right. So they get to say, ultimately, maybe we need to rethink that. So that, again, that's way, way, way above my pay grade, but that's the thumbnail sketch, and I think that's what Gary's talking about. So that's for aerial dispersants for subsea dispersant injection, the stuff that Tom was talking about. There is no pre-authorization for that, and none is anticipated in the foreseeable future. That is dealt with on an incident-specific basis, case by case. Is it part of the toolbox? Absolutely. Does it come into conversation very, very quickly? Yes, because we can't do, we're going to send all the mechanical resources that we can muster, and then if that doesn't work, then we're going to go to the next one. We know now with Macondo that you've got to launch everything that you have because there's not enough, and it's going to take time. So it's a collaborative effort, it's a discussion, it's one that's not taken lightly. It is important, and we document what we do, why we do it, and we stand by to answer any questions and comments. Lastly, on in situ burn, like aerial dispersants, that work was done in the mid-90s, and there is continuing pre-authorization to conduct in situ burns, open water, more than 3 miles offshore. As, who was talking about there? Paul. I think it was Paul. Maybe it was you. No, it was Charlie. It was Charlie. A lot of that work has been done, but it took till 2010 for any burns to be done in open water because it's hard and it takes a lot of time to get that done. So where do we do most of our burns? We do it onshore. And we did 3 burns between 1st of November and mid-December. We did 3 burns in about 6 weeks. Now that is odd, unusual. Before that, we've probably done 3 burns in 3.5 years. But it just goes to show you, the audience, both here and on the phone, that that is a tool in our toolbox, and we are aware of it, and we know where it can be used effectively, and we have the conversations and employ that technique as needed.
Mike, can I say a word here?
Have I missed anything, Gary?
Just one thing, and since I opened up this rabbit hole, I think it's worth adding this one additional piece of, even though there is a pre-authorization for surface application of dispersants in Region 6, that is not for an extended period of time on a Macondo scale response.
Right.
So it does, there is kind of an end point to that. And the reason I bring that up is because anything that's beyond 7 days, I think, would be considered atypical use. So in that case, you revert back to the case-by-case considerations, similarly to the same type of consideration you have to give to subsea use. So there may be pre-authorizations for surface application, but not
for the duration that we saw during Macondo, and before that, we never saw that anyway. But that's a good point, and that comes from the NRT, the National Response Team, a typical environmental monitoring guidelines that were published and they are available online. They were published in May of 2013.
Yeah, I think the point to add to that, Mike, was, to follow up on Gary's point, is that even though with pre-authorization to the FOSC, it required notification to the RRT, and when I was involved in developing those all the way back to the late 1990s on those rules, the attitude and the belief of the RRT was the reason that feedback would come in, even though there was no set time that if it went more than 7 days, was that they would be looking and reviewing the actions of the FOSC in context with the natural resource trustees. And if we felt that additional guidance was required from the guidance that's in the pre-authorization, that would be passed on. And any authorization the RRT granted to the FOSC can be removed by the RRT. So even though it didn't specifically put a date on it, the understanding was that given that this may happen and you have to make a decision at 4 o'clock in the morning, we're giving you the green light if you work under these rules. But it doesn't mean that we've totally washed our hands, we're not going to give our input from the RRT perspective. And that's the way it worked. Yeah.
Excellent point.
Yeah.
I think an important point to keep in mind is that we're not necessarily, hopefully, the authorities who are going to make the decisions aren't going to wait till the point where they decided conventional responses failed. And when you look at the scenario of a spill, you can know pretty early in the game, as in immediately, if you're going to be able to handle this conventionally or not. And if you get the report and you have a good sense of what's going on, then you may just say, we need to get dispersants out there right away, and not wait to fail with conventional. Additionally, the thing about dispersants, particularly spraying from the air, is that it's a very quick response. You can get that together in less than 12 hours. Right now on the Gulf of Mexico, I think you have to have your first capability take off in 6 hours. So, it's a very rapid response vis-a-vis the logistics of getting vessels, 20, 30, 40 miles offshore, and then start doing skimming operations. So I don't think you should leave here thinking that you're going to wait for conventional to fall on its face and then say it's time to call up dispersants. I think it can be a decision made at the outcome of an incident.
And just as a potential representative of a responsible party, hopefully never will be. I just want to point out that these discussions we have now are the important discussions we have well in advance of anything too. So as you can see that I think whether it's government agency, whether it's oil spill response organization, whether it's a responsible party, we at least understand the language and understand who we have to talk to. From my perspective, I would be talking to the NOAA Scientific Support Coordinator almost immediately to try to get on the phone with the RRT as quickly as we could, whatever the decisions are. Because ultimately we want to also document why we don't opt to do something. So I think it's a great discussion that we keep on having, and hopefully it's theoretical.
Okay, we'll have one more question. Go ahead.
I think it'll be a quick one.
Sure.
As,
We'll see.
yeah, we'll see, right? As an extension agent for Sea Grant and St. Tammany and Tangier parishes, I had a sidebar conversation with a colleague here who may or may not want to be recognized in this question that I'm going to ask. And it came up about reporting when an oil spill, something happens, people are responding, decisions are being made, the reporters who report on what's happening. My question to you is, we've seen sometimes that the right information isn't necessarily always getting out. They're reporting what they think is happening. Do you think it's worthwhile as an extension agent for me to reach out with the oil spill group and find a way to educate these people on how to report these things properly?
Yes.
And that's everybody in the
All in
room.
unison.
That's everybody in the room.
Okay, the answer is certainly yes. So I was the chair of the IPECA oil spill working group up until April. Now I'm the vice chair, but we just changed the name. I'm the lead of the outreach communications working group. And it's all about the materials we've developed post-Macondo, because you're exactly right. In 2010, the information either didn't exist or it was very difficult to find. And it was just too easy to find things that were misunderstood. So we've been spending a lot of time in that. So right now we're dealing both as industry associations, but also as individual industry to figure out how to do outreach and communication, stakeholder engagement, both internally and externally. Because we do find that, so ExxonMobil, we have 80,000 employees. And I'd say 75,000 don't know that much about dispersants. In reality, I think every ExxonMobil employee should be able to say in a minute why it might or might not be considered. But now how to do that externally, broadly, is really difficult. But that is a real charge we have. And part of why I happen to be here today is because I get invited to come. But that's my role, so I'm also a response advisor with focus on outreach and communication. Because we haven't done it very well in the past. And I typically say that if you ask an ExxonMobil person a question, the answer would be, well, here's 1,000 pages worth of technical material, just go read and come to your own conclusion. That doesn't work very well. So we talk, and working with OSRL in particular, around what we call confident ambassador, and what's the other phrase? It's the leveraging force multiplier. So the more that we can talk to people to at least know where to go, scientifically based facts is really what it's about. We've focused on, instead of the study and read, we call it the glance and scan. It's all based on the same stuff, but whether it's a one-page fact sheet or a 1,000-page research article, it all should say the same thing. It's just how do you get the materials into the environment, into the audiences in a way that makes sense. So the more we can share and at least expand that, And if you have questions, at least know who to go to hopefully get some information, because there is a lot of misinformation. My favorite website, I don't think it exists anymore, is about the dangers of dihydrogen monoxide. And how dangerous it kills people daily. And somebody actually cited that against the spill response community because that's a component in some of the materials we use, and it's just water. It's horrible, but that's the kind of thing we're faced with. So I'm sure somebody will back here.
From where you're at in the sea grant, you're actually in a very strong position. During these type of chaotic events, which are pretty typical of major oil spills that have people come as concerned, they're not going to trust, well, they'll trust DJ. They'll trust Dr. They won't trust most of us. And I remember that, I remember one time we were doing a press conference and the reporter said, Mr. Henry, Dr. Overton at LSU, says this, what do you think about that? They go, well, I worked for Dr. O for 13 years, and usually we're pretty much in agreement. I would argue with Dr. Overton. But you're considered a trusted person in the community. And whether it's with the public or whether it's with the media, they're supposed to be in a responsible mode to the public, and hopefully they will be in that responsible mode. You have a better vehicle because of your position than many of us to try to make that argument. So I encourage you the opportunity you can that we all try to be on the same page. Because when a real event happens, I didn't cause the spill, but I'm part of the bad problem. We're going to have to depend on people that have connections with the communities that are more trusted. And unfortunately, even though I think of myself as a trusted public servant, I'm not trusted. So.
As I've been listening to these discussions, the take-home message I think you could give the public is that none of these things are used on an ad hoc basis. There's always good, scientifically based reasons to use them, and it's gone through multiple agency review, right? So people just don't go out and do something to get rid of oil, and that's great. They're doing it for a reason, and that is the good news. There's science behind it, as VJ talked about. The science is evolving. We're going to come up with better and different mechanisms. But this is not just people wanting to go out and do something to get rid of out of sight, out of mind. There is a strong policy and science decision when these alternative methods are used to clean up oil spills.
I think that's a great note to end on. So, thank you
Mike,
guys.
I want to put in
Again, who invited him?
Directly to her question, a
Sure.
two-pronged plug, turns out that much of the information that is useful to the public is available from Sea Grant Oil Spill Outreach Program. And much of that is sitting right over there at the rack.
Please take a whole bunch.
Also, a plug for NOAA. NOAA is real good at, I don't know why Charlie can say this, his office in particular, and I'm sure they'll both agree, and their office in particular is really good at putting out that scan and short synopsis type information for the public. They're real good at that, and it's on the website. It's been there for a long time. Because I'm a lot like Tom. Somebody asks me, I'll end up giving them an 8-page document that but NOAA's real good at that.
Yeah, I think NOAA as a whole are probably one of the better on the federal side, but not used much. And Gary used to be part of this. Gary's retired NOAA, so.
Yeah, and I agree with all of y'all, all of what you said about where to find the information. The key point was, can we educate those media personalities? Can we educate those reporters to better report this stuff? And if you feel like y'all can help us do that, yeah, I'm Sea Grant, so I know where Emily's information is. My office is full of that stuff. We go to NOAA all the time. So if you think that's an effort worth us trying to, that's kind of my point, and I think, Tom, you said that would be.
And actually, Charlie and I were part of, it was a workshop that the Metcalf Institute did several years ago. I think it probably was at the Gomery Conference. And Metcalf is associated with the University of Rhode Island, and a lot of what they focus on is informing the press, or the media, however you want to call it. But yeah, it's exactly true. I see it.
The press that wants to learn.
Yes, well, yeah.
In the case of one event, does the incident command system have one outlet for information? Is that, yes, is there a person? So that should be.
What he's asking is,
And the answer is yes.
well, the answer is mostly yes.
Ideally.
From a unified command and response, when you have the RP and the FOSC and the other agencies working together collectively, there is always a portion of that that's called the Joint Information Center that tries to provide consensus reporting out of the command. That does not impede agencies from also speaking independently on their own. So it's actually both, because I think that we don't want to be inconsistent on those two messages. But what's going to come out of the JIC is what's the consensus, and there might be some fringe differences in opinion.
And that's what somebody in the media is wanting to find something controversial, something different. But
Right.
I mean, that happening.
And that happens, and that's what I usually, how I answer says, well, what you're hearing from the JIC is the consensus on what we all agree upon, not where we have differences of agreement.
That's a good
Yeah.
disclaimer
Yeah.
so they can understand that the information how it's given.
Yeah, but that is you're right, it's a good point.
So on that note, we're gonna wrap up.